When I handed over the envelope at the reception, the groom loudly declared to the whole table, "This is all the old man could manage." 52 guests spun around to look. My daughter turned bright red. Then one guest quietly stood up. He placed a thin folder on the table. The groom looked inside and bolted from the room in seconds. What was in that folder that made him run? Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. My name is Raymond Fletcher. I'm 64 years old, and I've lived in Nashville, Tennessee, long enough to know that this city has two faces. The one it shows to tourists on Broadway, all neon and honky-tonk, and the real one you only see after decades of paying property taxes and watching neighbors come and go. I own a small appraisal firm, Fletcher Property Advisors, Suite 201 on Deaton Road. 22 years, and not a single one of my valuations has been successfully challenged in court. Banks trust me. Insurance companies trust me. Law firms trust me. I walk into a property, and within 10 minutes, I can tell you what it's worth, what it's hiding, and whether the person selling it is being straight with you. People aren't that different from properties. You just have to know what to look for. I have one daughter. Her name is Brittany, and for 31 years she has been the only thing in my life that I didn't approach with professional detachment. She got her mother's laugh, the kind that fills a room before she even finishes the joke. She got my stubbornness, which I've chosen to call determination. When she was 9, she used to come down to the basement and watch me work on the clocks. I restore them. Antique timepieces, mostly American manufacturers from the mid-20th century. 41 of them lined up on shelves above the workbench. Some people find it strange. I find it meditative. You take something that has stopped working and figure out why. You don't guess. You open it up, look at every component, and the answer is right there. The mechanism doesn't lie. It can't. Brittany used to sit on the stool by the workbench and hand me tools she couldn't name yet, and we'd talk about everything and nothing. School. Her friends. What kind of person she wanted to be. Those were good years. I say that because context matters, and you need to understand what we had before I tell you what happened to it. She met Connor Gale at a corporate networking event about 2.5 years ago. She called me that same evening, and I could hear it in her voice. That particular brightness that means a person has decided something without realizing it yet. She told me he was a business development manager, that he was smart, ambitious, that he had big plans. I told her to bring him around for dinner. He came 3 weeks later, pulled up in a leased BMW. I noticed the dealer plates hadn't been replaced yet, and walked in like he was evaluating the place for a magazine feature. Not rude, not obviously so, but there's a specific kind of person who scans a room and mentally assigns a dollar value to everything in it, and Connor Gale was that kind of person. I recognized it because I do it for a living. The difference is I get paid to do it, and I don't do it to people's homes when they've invited me to dinner. He shook my hand with the right amount of pressure, practiced, not natural, and said, "Nice place, Raymond. Not bad for a man at your level." He smiled when he said it. Brittany didn't seem to notice anything. I smiled back and offered him a drink. I filed that sentence away, not in anger, just filed it. Over the following months, I watched him carefully. He had genuine charm. I won't take that from him. In a group, he was magnetic. He laughed at the right moments, asked questions that made people feel interesting, and had the particular skill of making whoever he was talking to believe they were his favorite person in the room. Brittany was radiant around him, and that, more than anything, was what kept me patient. But charm has a backside, and Connor's backside revealed itself in small moments, the kind he didn't think mattered because I was just the old man in the background. There was an afternoon, maybe 4 months after they started dating, when he came by while Brittany was still at work. He was early. I offered coffee and we sat at the kitchen table, and he started telling me about a real estate investment opportunity he was putting together. Nothing specific, just enough to feel impressive. At one point he gestured around the kitchen and said, "You know, this whole place could use some updating. The bones are good, but the finishes are dated. I could put you in touch with some people." I told him the house suited me fine. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they've already mentally overruled you, and said, Sure, whatever works for you." I noticed he spent a long time in the front hallway, looking at the framed property documents I keep there. The original deed, the survey map, the insurance certificate. Most people don't look twice at those. Connor looked at them twice. The engagement happened on a Tuesday evening in early September. Brittany called me, and the happiness in her voice was so complete that I pushed every concern 3 steps further back and told her I was thrilled. I meant it. She deserved happiness. What I did not mean to hear, what I was never supposed to hear, happened about 2 weeks after the engagement, on a Sunday afternoon. I had come in from the backyard and was walking through the hallway toward the kitchen when I heard Connor's voice from the living room. He was on the phone. The front door was still open, which is why he didn't hear me come in. "Listen, I'm telling you, it's solid," he was saying. "The old man is sitting on $600,000 in property minimum. The trust on Brittany's name goes back to 2009. She doesn't even know what's in it. He does, but he doesn't know I know." A pause, then quieter but still clear. "He won't be a problem. He doesn't play at this level. He doesn't even know there's a game." I was standing 2 feet from the kitchen doorway. I had a ceramic mug in my hand, the one with a small chip on the handle that I'd been meaning to replace for 3 years. I set it on the counter, quietly. I stood there for another 30 seconds, listening to him wrap up the call with something about timing and paperwork. Then I walked into the living room, smiled, and told him Brittany had called to say she'd be home in 20 minutes. He smiled back and put the phone in his pocket. That evening, after he left, I went down to the basement. I sat at the workbench and looked at the row of clocks on the shelf. On the far right, still in its original storage case, was a Hamilton pocket watch from 1961. Beautiful mechanism. Hadn't been opened in years. I'd been putting it off. It required more time and focus than the others. I looked at it for a long while. Then I turned off the workbench light and went to bed. I had some thinking to do. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes after a moment like that. Not anger. Anger clouds your thinking, and I couldn't afford cloudy thinking. What I felt was closer to what I feel when I walk into a property that's been staged to look better than it is. A kind of professional alertness. The disconnect between presentation and reality. The understanding that something needs to be measured accurately before any decision can be made. I have a memory from when Brittany was about 11 years old. A Saturday morning, summer. She'd found a bird in the backyard, a small brown wren, sitting very still in the grass, which healthy birds don't do. She came running inside, both hands cupped, telling me we had to fix it. I explained that sometimes we can't fix things, that the kindest thing was to leave it somewhere safe and quiet. She looked at me with those dark eyes and said, "But what if it just needs help and nobody helps it?" We put it in a shoebox under the hedge. By evening it was gone. Brittany had done what she could with what she knew. I thought about that bird a lot in the weeks that followed. The morning after I heard Connor on the phone, I sat at the kitchen table before sunrise with a yellow legal pad and wrote down, in as much detail as I could recall, every interaction with him that had given me pause. The comment about my level, the way he'd studied the deed documents, the investment pitch, the phone call, 14 separate observations over the course of 8 months. When I looked at that list, it didn't look like a list of coincidences. It looked like a pattern. And I know from 38 years of appraisal work that patterns don't lie. The next question was what I actually knew versus what I suspected. I suspected Connor Gale was not who he presented himself to be. I suspected his interest in Brittany was at least partly financial. What I didn't know was the specifics. And in my business, you don't put a number on something you haven't verified. I found Dexter Edwards through a recommendation from a colleague. Not a friend, just a man I'd worked with professionally, whose firm had used Edwards' services for a pre-acquisition background check. He had an office on Charlotte Avenue, second floor of a building that also housed a tax preparation service and a travel agency. The sign on the door said simply, Edwards Investigative Services. No tagline, no stock photo of a magnifying glass. I appreciated the lack of theater. He was a compact, quiet man in his 50s, with the kind of face that you forget 10 minutes after you've seen it, which is probably the most useful attribute a private investigator can have. We met on a Thursday morning. I told him what I wanted, the complete financial picture on Connor Allen Gale, age 34, currently residing, for now, at an apartment in Germantown, employment history, credit report through legal channels, civil court records, any real estate transactions, any business registrations. I gave him the leased BMW's partial plate number, the name of the company on Connor's LinkedIn profile, and the neighborhood of the apartment I'd looked up through public records. I paid him $3,800 in cash for a comprehensive report, 2 to 3 weeks turnaround. 3 weeks later, he handed me 14 pages in a manila envelope. I read them at the workbench in the basement, because that's where I do my most focused thinking. The clock parts were pushed to one side. Connor Allen Gale owed money to 7 separate creditors. The total outstanding balance across all accounts and judgments was $214,000. 2 of those creditors had already received civil judgments against him in Davidson County, meaning a Tennessee court had already ruled that he owed them the money, and those judgments were on the public record. There was a third creditor, a commercial lender whose case was pending. There was a real estate transaction from 3 years prior, a property flip that had collapsed, with the buyer filing a fraud complaint. The case had been closed for lack of evidence, but the complaint was detailed and specific. His current employer, the firm on the LinkedIn profile, turned out to be a one-person LLC he had registered himself 18 months ago. Business development manager, his own business, with no publicly available revenue and no registered clients. I read the report twice. Then I set it down on the shelf next to the Hamilton pocket watch from 1961, the one I hadn't opened yet. I looked at the 2 of them sitting there side by side. "All right," I said out loud to nobody in particular. "Time to open this one up." I'm not a dramatic man. I don't make speeches. But I'll tell you that in that moment, something shifted in how I was thinking about the situation. For 8 months, I had been watching and waiting and hoping I was wrong. The report confirmed I wasn't wrong. And the moment you confirm that a problem is real is the moment you stop grieving it and start solving it. I had been the patient father, giving the man the benefit of the doubt because my daughter loved him. That version of the situation was over. What came next was going to require a different approach entirely, the one I use when a property has been deliberately misrepresented and someone is about to get hurt by it. I closed the report. I put it in the locked drawer of the workbench, next to the original deed for the house. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Brittany, and her voice had that particular lightness in it, the kind she gets when she's already made up her mind about something and is calling me to share the good news, rather than ask for an opinion. "Dad," she said, "so Connor and I have been talking, and we think it makes the most sense, just for a few months while we're getting everything organized for the wedding. Would it be okay if we stayed with you? Just temporarily, until we find our place." I looked out the window at the backyard. The hedge where we'd put the bird in the shoebox was still there. "Of course," I said. "Come whenever you're ready." And I meant it, because if Connor Gale wanted to be under my roof, I was going to let him. A man who thinks he's won stops watching his back, and the moment he stopped watching his back was the moment I could start doing what I do best, measuring things accurately. They moved in on a Sunday morning. 2 cars, Brittany's Civic and Connor's leased BMW, both packed to the roof. I helped carry boxes. That's the kind of man I am. Even when I know something is wrong, I still help carry the boxes. Connor had a way of moving through a space that I can only describe as proprietary. Not aggressive, nothing you could call him out on directly, just a particular way of running his hand along a countertop or pausing in a doorway to look around a room like he was mentally measuring it for new furniture. He did it in the kitchen that first morning while Brittany made coffee. He stood at the window facing the backyard and said, "You know what this place needs? A deck. Proper one, not just the concrete slab out there. Add 15, maybe 20,000 to the resale value." He said it pleasantly, the way people discuss the weather. I said, "The slab has held up 31 years. I think it can manage a few more." He smiled in a way that contained no humor and went back to his phone. I noticed things I hadn't paid close enough attention to before. The way he spoke to Brittany, in a management tone, not unkind, but directive. Not, "Would you like to," but "We should. And you need to." The way he reached past her for the remote without asking. The way he set his coffee cup on the side table I built in 1998. even though there were coasters 18 inches away. Small things, individually weightless. But I have spent decades being paid to notice the difference between a property that is well maintained and one that is quietly being let go, and the signs are always small at first. He was also conducting his own assessment of me, though he was less subtle about it than he thought. That first week, he managed to work the following phrases into conversation. Is this house in your name, or is it more complicated than that? Do you have a financial advisor, or do you just keep things simple? And, most directly, Brittany mentioned you set up something for her years ago. One of those trust accounts? I answered each one with the kind of answer that closes a subject without providing information. It's straightforward. I manage things myself. We've had that conversation, and she has what she needs. He received all three answers with the same small nod and the same attentive expression, filing them away. I've met a lot of people who think they're the smartest person in a room. What distinguishes the dangerous ones is that they're sometimes right. Connor was smart. I want to be fair about that. He was persistent, he was observant, and he had the particular discipline of a person who has been working toward a specific goal, long enough that the work no longer feels like effort. But he had one flaw that I recognized immediately, because it's the same flaw I watch for in sellers who are trying to hide something. He was so focused on what he was after that he forgot to watch what I was doing. A week after they moved in, I drove downtown to 520 Commerce Street, 9th floor. The building directory listed a dozen law firms, and I took the elevator up without announcing myself. The receptionist at Vaughan and Killy asked if I had an appointment. I said I didn't, but that I had a matter involving a civil judgment situation that I believed was of interest to one of their partners. I gave her my card, plain white card, Fletcher Property Advisors, my direct number. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from Stephen Vaughan. He was a precise, composed man in his mid-50s. Gray at the temples, dark suit, the kind of office with exactly one personal item on the desk, a small photograph, and nothing else. He didn't waste time on small talk, which I appreciated. I told him I had documentation on a Connor Gale, currently residing at my address, whose financial record included judgments his firm was representing. I told him I was not looking for anything other than what the law provided. I wanted to understand what the legal process looked like from this point forward, and whether a confirmed residential address would be useful to any active civil case. Vaughan said it would. He pulled up his records, confirmed 2 of his clients held active judgments against Gale totaling $89,400, and said he was aware of 3 additional creditors pursuing consolidation. He explained that a confirmed, verifiable residential address was material to the process of enforcing those judgments. He asked if I was willing to provide a formal address confirmation. I said yes. He said his associate would prepare the paperwork, and I could review it before signing anything. I walked back to my car and sat for a moment. The first gear had engaged, quietly, without drama. When I got home, Brittany was out. Connor was in the living room on his laptop, on the dining room table, my dining room table, where I'd sat with Brittany every Sunday morning since she was 4 years old. There was an open manila folder, property documents, the original deed to 1847 Elm Hill Pike, which I kept in the hallway filing cabinet that I had apparently forgotten to lock. I picked up the folder without saying anything and went to the kitchen. A few minutes later, Connor appeared in the doorway. He had the expression of a man who wasn't sure whether he'd been caught at something or not. He said, "Sorry, I was looking for a pen and I bumped the cabinet. I didn't mean to." "It's fine," I said. "The cabinet sticks." He nodded slowly. Then, after a pause, "I didn't know property deeds were that long." "They're not usually," I said. "This one has an easement history attached." He absorbed that, nodded again, and went back to the living room. That evening I heard him on the phone again. From upstairs I couldn't make out the words, but I heard the tone, low, focused, the voice of someone who thinks they've found an opening. When Brittany came home, she called upstairs to say she was making dinner. Connor appeared in the hallway and said to her, loud enough to carry, "Hey, I keep meaning to ask your dad, do you know if he ever did a will, like a proper one?" Brittany said she thought so, but that he never talked about it. Connor said, in the way that means the subject isn't closed. I sat at the top of the stairs and let the silence settle. Then I went down to the basement, unlocked the workbench drawer, and took out Dexter Edwards' report. I read the section on the pending creditor cases one more time. 2 judgments already issued, 3 more in process. And Connor Gale, currently residing at 1847 Elm Hill Pike, Nashville, Tennessee, right where every one of those creditors would need him to be. I put the report back, locked the drawer. The mechanism was running. There is a specific satisfaction, I won't call it pleasure because that's not quite right, in doing something correctly. Not quickly, not dramatically, correctly. I have felt it at the end of a difficult appraisal, when every number checks out and the report is clean and defensible from every angle. I felt it in a different key during the weeks that followed. The morning after I heard Connor ask about the will, I drove to 311 Union Street. The office of Norma Bishop, notary public and estate documents specialist, was on the 2nd floor of a narrow brick building 2 blocks from the courthouse. I had used her services twice before for business documents, a lien release and a commercial lease addendum, and she was precise and discreet in the way that people who handle other people's important paperwork need to be. I had called ahead. When I arrived, she had the original trust documents on her desk, which I had provided the previous week, along with a summary of the amendments I needed. The trust had been established in 2009. Brittany was the named beneficiary. The original terms had been straightforward. In the event of my death, the assets held within the trust, at that time a savings account and a brokerage account, would transfer to her directly. Simple. The kind of thing that made sense in 2009. It no longer made sense in November of this year. We worked through the amendments systematically. The first was the property transfer, 1847 Elm Hill Pike, currently titled in my name, would be conveyed into the trust by means of a quitclaim. Deed. I would remain the trustee for the duration of my life, meaning I retained full control of the property, could continue to live there, and could sell it or modify it at my discretion. The property simply would no longer be subject to probate upon my death, and more importantly, it would no longer be reachable by any creditor whose claim arose after the trust's amendment date. The second amendment addressed distribution. The original terms had allowed for a lump sum transfer. The new terms specified that trust assets would be distributed to the beneficiary in equal annual installments over 10 years, beginning 1 year after the date of my death. This is called a spendthrift provision, and it does 2 things. It prevents a beneficiary from assigning their future interest to a third party, meaning Brittany could not pledge trust income as collateral, and it specifically insulates the distributions from claims by the beneficiary's creditors, or in a community property context, a spouse. Tennessee is not a community property state, but the provision adds an additional layer of protection regardless. The third amendment was the one I had thought about most carefully. It stated that no debt incurred by the beneficiary or her spouse, prior to or following my death, could be satisfied from trust assets. Norma reviewed the amendments, confirmed they were consistent with Tennessee trust law, and prepared the execution documents. I signed. She notarized. The deed transfer would be recorded with Davidson County within 7 business days. On the drive home, I stopped at a branch of my bank and opened a secondary account, with a $47,000 transfer from my operating account. This was the litigation reserve, money set aside specifically for legal fees and court costs, separate from my personal finances and the trust. I titled the account clearly in my own records, Legal Reserve, Gale Matter. I want to be honest about something. There were moments during those weeks when I wondered whether I was going too far, whether I was doing something cold-blooded that I would regret. Brittany loved this man. Genuinely, I believe that. And the things I was doing were legal, methodical, and entirely within my rights as a property owner and trustee. But they were also calculated to construct, piece by piece, a situation from which Connor Gale would not be able to extract himself cleanly. I thought about that on the drive home. I thought about him standing at my kitchen window, talking about adding a deck, about his voice through the ceiling asking about my will, about 14 pages of debt and a real estate fraud complaint that was closed for lack of evidence, not for lack of conduct. Then I pulled into the driveway and went inside. Connor was at the kitchen table with his laptop. He looked up and said, "Where were you?" "Errands," I said. I poured a glass of water and asked if Brittany was home yet. She wasn't. 3 days later, Connor sat down across from me at the kitchen table after dinner. Brittany had gone upstairs. He had the manner of someone who has rehearsed a conversation and is trying to make the rehearsal invisible. He said that he had a business situation, temporary, he was clear about that, and that he needed to move some capital around quickly. He said he was asking whether I would be willing to extend what he called a short-term arrangement, $18,000 over 3 months, after which he would return it with 4% interest. He laid it out like a pitch, structured, confident, the way he probably handled every negotiation. I looked at him for 3 seconds. I counted. "I'll think about it," I said. His expression shifted slightly. Not disappointment, exactly. More like recalibration. He nodded and said, "Of course, take your time." He went upstairs. I sat at the table and looked at the grain of the wood for a while. $18,000. 4% interest. 3 months. The kind of offer that is designed to make the other person feel like they're getting something, while the person making it secures something worth considerably more than $18,000. I would not be lending Connor Gale $18,000, but I was not going to tell him that yet. A man who thinks a decision is still pending stays in place. A man who has been told no starts looking for another route. I needed him exactly where he was for a few more weeks. I went to the basement. I looked at the Hamilton on the shelf. 14 days since I'd amended the trust. 7 since the deed transfer had been recorded with Davidson County. The paperwork was done. The legal position was secured. What came next was not mine to arrange. The creditor's attorneys would handle their own process. My role now was to do the one thing I had always been best at. Wait and watch and let the mechanism run. The week between Connor's loan request and the reception was the quietest of the whole ordeal. He was waiting for my answer. I was waiting for the right moment. We were both very polite about it. I had given the situation some thought, and I'd arrived at a conclusion about the envelope. Connor was going to attend that reception expecting one of two things: either a check large enough to signal that I was cooperative and could be managed further, or a refusal that he could spin to Brittany as evidence that I was withholding support from their future. Either outcome served him. What he was not expecting, what he had not factored into his calculations at all, was a third option. So I wrote a check for $1,200. 1,200 is the kind of number that means something specific. It's not insulting in the way that $50 would be insulting. It's not negligible. But it is for a man who has spent months calculating access to a $600,000 property and a trust account that's been compounding since 2009, a profoundly clarifying number. It tells you exactly what the other person thinks of you. Not with anger, with clarity. I put it in a plain white envelope. No card, no decorative paper, no bow. The kind of envelope you get in a box of 200 from the office supply store. I set it on the kitchen counter the morning of the reception and looked at it for a moment. Then I put on my navy suit, the one from the funeral in 2019, the one that still fits because I've weighed the same for 11 years, and drove to the Southern Magnolia Banquet Hall. The venue was on the east side, off McGavock Pike, a converted building with cream walls and dark wood trim, the kind of place that does 40 weddings a year and has the process down to a precise choreography. Valet parking, a man in a bow tie at the door, a jazz quartet in the corner working through something slow and cheerful. 52 guests. I knew the number because Brittany had told me twice, with a particular emphasis of someone who wants you to understand that a significant event is occurring. Connor was in a gray suit with a pocket square. He looked like a magazine advertisement for a financial services company, the kind that runs on the back page with a confident man and soft lighting and a tagline about your future. Brittany was radiant. That's the only honest word. She had her mother's ability to fill a room just by being happy in it, and she was happy. I sat with that for a moment before I found my table. I am not going to pretend the evening was unpleasant. The food was good. The jazz quartet was better than most. I spoke to 2 couples I hadn't seen since before the engagement, old acquaintances of mine from the Nashville appraisal community, people who asked sensible questions and laughed at appropriate moments. Connor worked the room with the ease of a man who had done it many times, and I watched him with the professional detachment I usually reserve for properties I'm evaluating. The gift presentation came an hour into the reception. It was informal. Guests approached the table in no particular order, set down their envelopes in wrapped boxes, offered congratulations. When my turn came, I walked up to the table, shook Connor's hand, firm, appropriate, the handshake of a man who has nothing to apologize for, kissed Brittany on the cheek, and set the plain white envelope on the table in front of Connor. He picked it up with the confident ease of a man who has been receiving envelopes all evening. He opened it. He looked at the check. The number registered. I watched his face go through a sequence of adjustments. Surprise, recalibration, something that was working very hard to become amusement. And then he turned to the table. Not to me, to the table, to the audience, and said it loud enough for the nearest 20 people to hear clearly. "Is this all the old man could manage?" 3 or 4 people laughed, not the whole room, not all 52, but enough. I watched the heads turn, the couples nearest us, the ones who had been mid-conversation, pausing. The jazz quartet didn't stop, but the sound of the room shifted slightly, the way it does when something has happened that people are deciding whether to acknowledge. Brittany's face went red in a single second, the particular red of someone who is humiliated and furious, and cannot say either of those things out loud. I stood straight, hands in my pockets. I did not smile. I did not look at the people who had turned to see what would happen next. I looked at Connor, and Connor looked at me, and for a moment there was nothing in that exchange except 2 people who understood each other completely. Then I went back to my seat. The jazz quartet moved into something with more tempo. Conversation resumed. The moment was absorbed into the evening the way these moments always are, quickly, incompletely, with a residue that everyone present would carry home without quite knowing what to do with it. I sat down and picked up my glass. The woman to my left, someone's aunt from Chattanooga, as it turned out, leaned toward me and said quietly, "That was rude of him." "Yes," I said. "It was?" She nodded. We didn't discuss it further. I checked my watch. It was 12 minutes past 8. Stephen Vaughan was at a table near the back wall. He had arrived 40 minutes earlier, signed the guest book under the name of one of the creditor firms, and found his seat without drawing attention. I had not looked at him directly all evening. I did not look at him now. But I knew he was there, and I knew what he was holding. And I knew that 30 seconds was approximately how long it would take for Connor Gale's confidence to transform into something else entirely. I counted the seconds the way I count anything when precision matters. 1, 2. Around 8 or 9, I heard a chair move near the back of the room. Stephen Vaughan stood up. He was not a tall man, but he had the bearing of someone who has spent 30 years in courtrooms. That particular quality of stillness that reads as absolute confidence without requiring any performance. Dark suit, gray at the temples, leather portfolio, standard A4 size, the kind that closes with a magnetic snap. He walked toward the head table with the unhurried certainty of a man who has every right to be exactly where he is going. I kept my eyes on my glass. The room had mostly resumed its normal texture. Conversations, the clinking of silverware, the quartet finishing something and beginning something else. Vaughan reached the table. He set the portfolio on the tablecloth in front of Connor, directly on top of the unwrapped gifts, and said in a voice that was not loud but was perfectly clear, "Mr. Gale, these documents are for you. This would be a convenient time to review them." Connor looked up. He saw a man in a dark suit he didn't recognize. He glanced at the portfolio. His expression was that of someone who has just been handed something unexpected at a party and is deciding whether to be annoyed or charmed. He said, "What is this?" Vaughan said, "The title page will explain." Connor picked it up. He opened it. I was looking at my glass, but I had positioned my chair at an angle that gave me a clear view of his face in my peripheral vision, and I had 38 years of reading rooms. The title page read, "Notice of Consolidated Civil Judgment, Davidson County, Tennessee." Below that, 5 creditor names. Below that, a total amount, $214,000. Below that, a judge's signature and a filing date, the day before the reception. I watched the color leave his face. It didn't drain slowly. It went, the way it goes in people who have just understood something with their whole body at once. His jaw moved slightly, the beginning of a word that didn't form. He turned the page. The second page was the address confirmation, 1847 Elm Hill Pike, Nashville, Tennessee, his current residence, his confirmed, legally documented, verifiable residential address. The third page was a property description. He read it. He read it a second time. Brittany was watching him. She had gone very still, the way she goes still when she knows something is wrong, but doesn't yet know what. The 2 or 3 guests nearest the table had noticed that something was happening. The quality of Connor's attention had changed the air around him, the way extreme weather changes air pressure before you can see the clouds. Connor set the portfolio down. He pushed back his chair. He stood up, and for a moment he just stood there, the folder open on the table in front of him, the jazz quartet playing something in a minor key that no one had requested. Then he looked at me. I looked back. I want to be precise about what was on my face in that moment, because I've thought about it since. It was not satisfaction exactly. It was not triumph. It was closer to what I feel at the end of a particularly difficult appraisal. The particular stillness of a thing correctly completed. 38 years of measuring things accurately, and this was the most accurate measurement I had ever made. I did not smile. Connor picked up the portfolio with both hands. For a moment I thought he was going to say something. To me, to the room, to Brittany. His mouth opened. Whatever he was going to say, he decided against it. He set the portfolio back down on the table with more force than he intended. Not a slam, but enough that the silverware near it shifted. Several heads turned. Then he walked toward the exit. Not running. Walking fast, the walk of a man who is choosing, with considerable effort, not to run. The doors to the banquet hall were at the far end of the room, and every step of that walk happened in front of 43 of the 52 guests, who were now, with varying degrees of subtlety, watching. The doors closed behind him. The sound they made, not a slam, more of a definitive thud, hung in the room for a moment. No one spoke for about 4 seconds. Then a woman near the back laughed at something her companion said, and the quartet shifted into something with a clearer rhythm, and the room settled back into the ordinary texture of an evening that had just become more interesting than expected. Brittany was staring at the folder. She hadn't touched it. Her face was unreadable, not blank, but processing, the expression of someone who is working through several things at once and has not yet arrived at any of them. Vorn caught my eye from across the room. A small nod. He closed his jacket button, lifted his water glass, set it back down, and remained at his table. There was nothing further for him to do tonight. The filing was already in. The process was in motion. His role here had been simple and precise. Delivery of a document at a specific time to a specific person at a specific address. I turned back to my plate. The food was still good. The quartet was playing well. And for the first time since September, I felt the specific relief of a man who has been carrying a weight quietly for a long time and has finally set it down in exactly the right place. Brittany looked up from the folder. Her eyes found me across the table. I met her gaze. I didn't explain. I didn't look away. She closed the folder. She set it on the table beside the gifts. Her hands were steady. The evening continued. Around us, 51 people talked, ate, and gradually began absorbing the fact that the groom had left his own reception. The reasons, I suspected, would be discussed and speculated over for some time. By tomorrow morning, Connor Gale would have a far more pressing set of concerns than what people were saying at dinner parties. And I had a drive home to look forward to. The quiet kind along Elm Hill Pike, with the windows down and the Nashville night doing what Nashville nights in early December do, which is remind you that even in winter, this city has a certain warmth to it if you know where to look. I left at 9:15. I said goodbye to Brittany. She held my hand for a moment longer than the hug required. She didn't ask me anything. Not yet. But I knew she would. He was back the next morning. I heard the BMW in the driveway at 7:42. I was in the kitchen with coffee, and I had been expecting him, not necessarily that early, but in that general window of time. A man who has just had a public reversal of fortune, and a night to think about it either disappears or comes back swinging. Connor was not the disappearing type. He came through the front door without knocking. He still had a key, technically still lived there, at least on paper, and stood in the kitchen doorway in the clothes he'd worn the night before, minus the jacket and tie. His face had the particular tightness of someone who has been awake for most of the night, and has, over those hours, worked himself from shock into strategy. "We need to talk," he said. "Good morning," I said. He sat down at the kitchen table. I poured a second cup of coffee and set it in front of him without being asked, because that's the kind of man I am, and also because there is something slightly disorienting about having someone be genuinely courteous to you when you've come prepared for a fight. He looked at the coffee for a moment. Then he looked at me. "That man last night," he said. "You arranged that." "I arranged for legal documents to be delivered on schedule," I said. "The timing was a coincidence of your choosing, not mine." He absorbed that. "You've been building a case against me." "I've been informed of your financial situation," I said, "through lawful means by parties with standing to disclose it." He was quiet for a moment. I could see him recalculating. This was not the conversation he'd rehearsed. He'd come prepared for me to either bluster or apologize, and I was doing neither. "Here's what I know," he said, and his voice had dropped into a different register, lower, more deliberate. The pitch of a man conducting a negotiation rather than an argument. "I know Brittany is the beneficiary of a trust. I know this house is a significant asset. And I know that a man in a position like mine has options when it comes to disputed assets in a household where he resides." "That's an interesting sentence," I said, "particularly the word disputed." "I'm saying there are legal routes." "There are always legal routes," I said. "That's the thing about the law. It runs in multiple directions." He left 2 hours later. He went upstairs, packed a bag, and told Brittany he needed space to handle the situation with his attorney. Brittany came to the kitchen after he left. She looked like someone who had been crying for about 6 hours and was now operating on something closer to numbness. She sat across from me. I waited. "Who was that man at the reception?" she said. "An attorney," I said. "He represents some of the people Connor owes money to." She was quiet. "How much?" she said finally. $214,000, I said, "across several creditors. 2 of the judgments were filed in Davidson County before the reception." She looked at the table. "He told me he had a cash flow situation, temporary." "I know," I said. 4 days later, a certified letter arrived at 1847 Elm Hill Pike, addressed to Raymond Arthur Fletcher. The return address was the law office of a Marcus Dolby, 201 4th Avenue North. I opened it and read it twice. The letter stated that Connor Allen Gale, through his legal representative, was asserting that Raymond Fletcher had made an oral promise to satisfy Connor's outstanding debts as a wedding gift, not less than $214,000. The letter claimed this promise constituted a binding commitment under promissory estoppel, and demanded either payment or written acknowledgement within 14 business days. I set the letter on the kitchen table. I looked at it. Then I did something that I suspect surprised no one who knows me. I called Stephen Vaughan, Vaughan's associate, Justin Hall, a young man I'd spoken to twice before, efficient and concise, pulled up the relevant Tennessee statute within 90 seconds. Tennessee Code, annotated Section 29-2-101. Any promise or commitment involving an amount greater than $500 must be in writing to be legally enforceable. A verbal promise, regardless of the circumstances under which it was made, carries no legal weight in a Tennessee court when the claimed amount exceeds that threshold. "So his claim has no legal foundation," I said. "As currently stated, no," Bourne said when he came on the line. "The estoppel argument requires demonstrable reliance, meaning he'd need to show he changed his position in some concrete, documented way based on your alleged promise. Without a written agreement, that argument is very difficult to sustain." "He's testing to see if I'll settle," I said. "Almost certainly," Bourne said. I told him to prepare a written response for my signature, declining the claim on the grounds stated, and noting that I had made no such promise. No settlement, no acknowledgement, just the law, stated plainly, signed and certified. That evening, Brittany came downstairs. She'd been on the phone most of the afternoon. She sat at the kitchen table again. She'd been spending a lot of time at the kitchen table lately, which meant we were having real conversations again after a long gap, which I noted with something I wasn't ready to call relief yet. "He told me," she said, "that you're trying to destroy him." I looked at her for a moment. "I'm protecting myself," I said, "and if I happen to be doing it rather thoroughly, that's because he gave me reason to be thorough." She was quiet for a long time. "I didn't know about the debts," she said. "I know," I said again. This time she didn't leave quickly. We sat at the table until the light changed, and she asked me questions I answered honestly, and at the end of it she said she needed more time. I told her to take whatever she needed. I meant it. The legal claim about the oral promise was resolved in 11 days. Our written response went out certified mail on a Thursday. The following Monday, Vaughan received confirmation that Dolby's office had received it. There was no further communication on that particular argument. Connor had moved to a short-term rental in Germantown. Ironic, given that was where he'd been living when Edwards first investigated him. He was still calling Brittany regularly. She was still answering. I didn't comment on that. It wasn't my call to make. What was my call, and what required my full attention, was the document that arrived from Davidson County Circuit Court 3 weeks after the reception. Connor, through Marcus Dolby, had filed a formal petition. The petition was more sophisticated than the letter had been, which told me that either Dolby had done his homework or Connor had brought in additional counsel. The argument went as follows. Connor Gale had resided at 1847 Elm Hill Pike as a long-term occupant in a relationship with the designated trust beneficiary. By virtue of that residency and his status as Brittany's fiancé, and as of the wedding ceremony that had technically taken place before the filing, her husband, he was asserting an equitable interest in the trust property. Equitable interest is a real legal doctrine. It's the kind of argument that, if not answered properly, can create complications. I want to be honest about that. When Vaughan explained the filing to me over the phone, I felt something I hadn't felt since September. Not quite worry, something closer to respect for the opponent's move. "He's not wrong that the doctrine exists," Vaughan said. "He's wrong about how it applies here." He walked me through it. Equitable interest claims in trust property require in Tennessee that the claimant demonstrate some form of contribution to the trust corpus. Money invested, improvements made, obligations assumed. Connor had contributed nothing to the trust. He had lived in the house for approximately 6 weeks before the wedding, during which time he had paid no rent, made no improvements, and assumed no financial obligations. His name appeared nowhere in the trust documents. More critically, the property had been transferred into the trust on the 14th of November. The wedding had occurred on the 6th of December. Under Tennessee law, assets transferred into a revocable trust prior to a marriage are not considered marital property, subject to equitable division, a rule that exists precisely to prevent this kind of claim. "The timing is the whole case," Vaughan said. "The deed was recorded 3 weeks before the wedding. That's not a close call." "Then why is there a hearing?" I said. "Because he filed a petition and paid the filing fee," Vaughan said. "The court doesn't evaluate merit before scheduling. It schedules, then evaluates. The hearing is in about 5 weeks." I spent the following week pulling together the document package that Vaughan needed. The original trust agreement from 2009, the amendment dated November 14th, the notarized deed transfer, the Davidson County recording confirmation, and Norma Bishop's notarial certification. I had all of it in the locked drawer of the workbench. I photographed each document, made 3 sets of copies, stored 1 set in a safe deposit box at my bank on Murfreesboro Road, and delivered the originals to Vaughan's office on Commerce Street. Justin Hall, Vaughan's associate, reviewed everything and confirmed it was complete. He was thorough. He went through each page, cross-referenced the dates, checked the recording stamps. When he was done, he looked up and said, without particular emphasis, "This is a very clean file." I told him I'd had 38 years of practice keeping clean files. Then the second letter arrived. It came from Dolby's office, addressed to me personally, not through Vaughan. 4 pages. The language was formal, but the content was pointed. The petition had been amended. Connor's attorneys were now adding a secondary argument. They were asserting that the November 14th trust amendment constituted a fraudulent transfer, specifically that I had moved the property into the trust with the intent to hinder or delay a creditor. The creditor they cited was Connor Gale himself. I read the letter at the kitchen table. Then I read it again. There were two problems with this argument, both of which I could identify without legal training. First, a fraudulent transfer claim requires that the person making the transfer was already a debtor to the alleged creditor at the time of the transfer. I had no debt to Connor Gale on the 14th of November. I had no debt to him on any date. There was no note, no agreement, no obligation of any kind between us, written, oral, or otherwise. Second, the fraudulent transfer statute in Tennessee is designed to protect legitimate creditors, not to prevent property owners from managing their own assets in lawful ways. But the word fraudulent in a legal document has a particular weight. I noticed it. I'm sure he expected me to notice it. I called Vorn that evening. He was quieter than usual when I described the amendment. "He's escalating," I said. "He is," Vorn said. "And I want to be direct with you. This doesn't change the legal outcome, but it changes the scope of what we're dealing with. A fraudulent transfer allegation, even a baseless one, will require a response at the hearing. We'll need to be prepared." "How prepared?" I said. "Completely," he said. I went down to the basement that night. The Hamilton pocket watch was still on the shelf where I had put it in October. I looked at it for a moment. Then I picked it up, took it to the workbench, and set it under the lamp. I had 5 weeks before the hearing. That was enough time to do this properly. I opened the case. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in January, courtroom 4B of the Davidson County Circuit Court on 2nd Avenue North. I arrived 20 minutes early, the way I arrive everywhere. Vorn was already there with Justin Hall, 2 litigation bags between them and a set of tabbed binders that I recognized as the document package I'd assembled. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, a gallery of a dozen wooden seats. Connor arrived with Marcus Dolby 7 minutes before the scheduled start. He was in a dark suit, cleanly shaved, expression managed. He did not look at me when he walked in. I noted that. The judge was a woman in her mid-50s named Whitmore, and she had the manner of someone who has seen every variation of this kind of dispute and is prepared to be efficient about it. She reviewed the filed documents, asked both parties to confirm their representation, and indicated she had read the petitions in full. Dolby presented the fraudulent transfer argument first. It was, as arguments go, structured and earnest. The premise was this. Raymond Fletcher had transferred his primary residence into a revocable trust shortly after becoming aware of Connor Gale's financial situation, with the intent to place those assets beyond the reach of creditors, of whom Gale was one by virtue of the alleged oral promise. Judge Whitmore let him finish. Then she asked one question. Was there, at the time of the transfer, any written or recorded agreement establishing a debt relationship between Mr. Fletcher and Mr. Gale? Dolby said the debt arose from an oral commitment. The judge said, "Counsel, a fraudulent transfer claim requires an existing creditor relationship. You're asking me to treat an unwritten, disputed, verbal statement as the basis for a creditor claim that would then retroactively render a property transfer fraudulent. Do you see the logical problem?" Dolby began to explain promissory estoppel again. The judge allowed him 2 minutes. Then she turned to Vorn. Vorn stood up. He was, as always, unhurried. He confirmed the date of the trust amendment, the 14th of November. He confirmed the date of the wedding, the 6th of December. He noted that at the time of the transfer there was no marriage, no creditor relationship, no document of any kind connecting Raymond Fletcher to Connor Gale as a debtor. He placed the original trust agreement, the amendment, and the notarized deed transfer on the clerk's table in sequence, each one dated and certified. Then he said, "Your Honor, I'd also like to submit, with the court's permission, a supplemental exhibit." He handed a bound document to the clerk. I watched the clerk deliver a copy to Dolby, who opened it and began reading. His expression shifted in a way that was very quiet and very definitive. The expression of someone who has just understood that the room they're in is smaller than they thought it was. The document was Dexter Edwards' report, not the 14-page version from October. The updated version, 22 pages, expanded to include 3 years of financial activity, cross-referenced with public records. It detailed, among other things, Connor Gale's pattern of transferring personal assets, a vehicle, a small brokerage account, a receivable from a dissolved LLC, to third parties within 60 to 90 days before civil judgment dates. The technical term for this is fraudulent conveyance. The difference between what he was accusing me of and what the report documented was that his transfers were designed to evade existing creditors. Mine was not. Vaughan noted, for the record, that copies of the supplemental exhibit had been forwarded to the Davidson County District Attorney's Office as potentially relevant to an ongoing civil matter. Connor, seated next to Dolby, had gone very still, not the controlled stillness of a man managing his presentation, the stillness of a person whose internal calculations have just been interrupted by a fact they hadn't included in their model. I sat with my hands folded on my legal pad and looked at the clock on the courtroom wall. It read 9:47. The mechanism was running exactly as it should. Judge Whitmore spent 11 minutes reviewing the exhibit. Then she adjourned the hearing for 30 days to allow both parties to submit written responses. But her final comment before adjournment was addressed to Dolby directly. She said that in the court's preliminary view, the fraudulent transfer claim appeared to lack the factual predicate required by Tennessee statute, and that she would expect the petitioner to address this threshold question in any supplemental filing. We walked out at 10:23. In the courthouse corridor, Connor stopped 10 feet from me. For a moment I thought he was going to say something. Dolby put a hand on his arm, and Connor turned and walked toward the elevator. Vaughan stood beside me. "The DA's office will take it from here as far as the asset conveyance question," he said. "Our focus now is the judgment enforcement." "How long?" I asked. 6 to 8 weeks, he said, "possibly less." I thanked him, drove back to Deaton Road, and spent the rest of the morning on an appraisal I'd been postponing for a week. The work was straightforward. I finished it by 2 in the afternoon and filed the report. The judge's written ruling came 5 weeks after the hearing. Vaughan called me on a Thursday morning and read the relevant passages over the phone, though I had already received my own copy by mail. The language was precise, as court language always is. Every claim filed by Connor Allen Gale against Raymond Arthur Fletcher had been dismissed. The equitable interest argument, dismissed for failure to establish a contribution to the trust corpus. The fraudulent transfer claim, dismissed for failure to establish a creditor relationship predating the transfer. The oral promise claim, dismissed under Tennessee Code, annotated Section 29-2-101, the written instrument requirement. In the same ruling, the judge confirmed the consolidated civil judgment against Connor Gale in favor of 5 creditors, total amount $214,000, enforceable through standard collection procedures, including wage garnishment, bank levy, and asset seizure. He had 90 days to satisfy the judgment or enter a payment arrangement. His current residential address, the short-term rental in Germantown, was on file with the court. I set the ruling on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. Then I folded it, put it in the same drawer where I keep utility bills and property tax records, and made breakfast. Connor moved out of the Germantown rental 2 weeks before the ruling. Vaughan's associate, Justin Hall, confirmed this through a routine address check. He'd relocated to Memphis, which was outside Davidson County's immediate enforcement reach, but not outside the state. The judgment followed him. Judgments in Tennessee are valid for 10 years and can be renewed. Brittany called me the evening after the ruling. She had already spoken to Vaughan's office. She'd called them directly, which told me something about where she was in her own process. She asked me to explain the trust amendments. I did, plainly and completely. I told her about the spendthrift provision, the 10-year distribution schedule, the debt shield clause. I told her that none of it reduced what she would eventually receive. It only changed the timing and the structure, specifically to ensure that no one else could touch it. She was quiet for a while. "You did all of this before the reception," she said. "Yes," I said, "before I knew any of it." "Yes." Another silence. "You were protecting me," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I was protecting both of us," I said. from a situation I could see more clearly than you could at the time. She came over 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon. She let herself in with her key, the way she had since she was 16. I was in the kitchen. She sat down at the table across from me, the same chair she always uses, and we had the kind of conversation that takes a long time and doesn't require a lot of words. She said she didn't know about the debts. I said I know. She said she thought she knew who he was. I said most people do, until they don't. She said she was embarrassed about the reception, about the envelope comment, about not saying anything when he said it. I told her the $1,200 had served its purpose. She looked at me for a moment, and then she made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. And I poured us both tea, and we sat at the table until it got dark outside. Connor Gale, by the time of Brittany's visit, her estranged husband and a subject of active judgment, enforcement proceedings, was not mentioned again that afternoon. There was nothing more to say about him that the court documents hadn't already said, more precisely and with better authority than either of us could manage. I washed the cups when she left. Then I went downstairs. The Hamilton pocket watch from 1961 was on the workbench under the lamp, where I'd been working on it for the past several weeks. It was, as I'd suspected from the beginning, a complex job. The mainspring had been set incorrectly at some point in its history. Not broken, just wrongly tensioned, which had thrown off the entire rate. These things happen to mechanisms when someone who doesn't know what they're doing gets inside them. I had it running now, not perfectly. There was still some fine adjustment needed in the escapement, but running, steady, measurable, correct within about 4 seconds a day, which is well within tolerance for a piece of this age. I set it under the lamp, picked up my tools, and went back to work. I'm Raymond Fletcher. I'm 64 years old. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and I appraise property for a living. I know the value of things. I know how to read what a document says and what it doesn't say. I know how to wait and how to work carefully, and how to open a mechanism that has been closed too long and find out exactly what's wrong with it. Some people will tell you that patience is a passive thing, that waiting is the same as doing nothing. Those people have never restored a clock. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you. That means something. Raymond Fletcher is a fictional character, but I want to be direct with you. The situation he found himself in is not fictional at all. Every week, people across this country, many of them in their 60s and 70s, face some version of what Raymond faced. A family member who begins treating them not as a person but as an asset to be managed, a property to be inherited, an account to be accessed. And the most painful part isn't the financial threat, it's the silence of the people who could have said something and didn't. Raymond didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He did something quieter and considerably more effective. He learned his rights. He documented everything, and he made decisions with a clear head before the pressure was on. That's the whole story, really. Here's the practical takeaway, and I want you to hear this clearly if you're over 50 and you own property or have savings. A revocable living trust is one of the most underused legal tools available to ordinary Americans. Most people think it's only for the wealthy. It's not. In most states, including Tennessee, you can establish one for between $800 and $1,500 through any licensed estate attorney or notary. It lets you keep full control of your assets while you're alive. You can change it, revoke it, manage it exactly as you do now. But it also protects those assets from the probate process after your death. And, crucially, it can be structured with provisions that protect your beneficiaries from having those assets seized to pay their debts or their spouse's debts. If you have a home, savings, or any significant asset, and you have someone you want to leave it to someday, have that conversation with an estate attorney this week. Not someday, this week. And if you're listening to this because something about Raymond's story felt uncomfortably familiar, if someone in your life has been making you feel small or treating your home and your money as though they already belong to them, I want you to know that you're not alone. It happens in good families, to careful people, to parents who gave everything they had. It is not your fault, and you have more options than you may realize. Tell someone you trust. Talk to a professional. And know that the people who handle these situations most effectively are usually the ones who do exactly what Raymond did. Stay calm, think clearly, and act early. Leave a comment below and tell us what you thought of this story. If it resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't, so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next one.